and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Good morning, Helen. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
See, I just did that effortlessly. It just flowed out, and I haven't done it for a while.
No, you haven't. That's good. Well done.
I've been on my own for a couple of times. I didn't have to say it. I was on my own. So
I am good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Looking forward to another podcast episode. What are we talking about today, Helen?
Well, we kind of left our listeners in the lurch with difficult
Oh, we did, didn't we? Yes.
So I think we're going to pick that up.
Yes, I set a bit of a precedent when you were away by having a two-parter.
You did.
Like loving the coaching with part 1 and part 2. So this is Difficult Conversations part 2.
Yes.
So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about. Good.
And we talked last time a little bit about how people manage themselves in terms of difficult conversations, whether they avoid them.
Yeah, the whole Thomas and Kilman thing.
Yeah.
So that's great coaching territory to look at how people approach difficult conversations, whether they actually ever have any or have them almost too quickly and just get angry and just shout at people.
Yeah.
So either end of the spectrum. And we looked at the potential costs of avoiding conversations. And I think that's one of the tactics people have, or one of the ways in which people go about difficult conversations. So people tend to avoid them, have them badly, or a few people have them well. And I think that's where we're going to get to today, is how we might go about having a difficult conversation well. So I think it's useful for a coach to have some understanding of this, because obviously if they come to coach someone who is going to have a difficult conversation, they might want to play it out.
Yeah.
They might want to role play. They might want to do an empty chair exercise. They might in some way want to go through it with you. And even if it's just, I certainly had someone recently that said, okay, look, I'm going to have this conversation. I sort of know what I want to say, but I want to say it out loud. Can you just listen to it? Tell me what you think. So he did that. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, to be fair, it doesn't really matter what I think. Let's hear what she thinks. So come and sit in this chair. You've now heard what you've said as her. So what does she think? So we did that, and that worked really well. So there are ways in which we might play it out. But I think it's useful for us as a coach to offer some feedback if someone is getting it horribly wrong. And I had this recently with someone where it was just a coaching practice session where someone was saying they were going to have this conversation with a trainee, and who wasn't kind of showing up and stuff. So she had the conversation like in front of me, and it wasn't a particularly helpful way to approach the conversation. So it was just straight in. Well, you're not doing this and you're not doing that. And you need to be doing it. Otherwise, it's going to end up like, and it was a very much controlling parent approach to having the conversation. Mm. So it was helpful, but in her doing that, in her playing it out, she didn't recognize that it was unhelpful. So I think, again, having that understanding of how difficult conversations might be done well, then I think there's room there. There's a bit of information sharing about maybe a model and how it might be useful to go about doing it.
So you mentioned there maybe having a model. What model do you have?
I don't. No, I do. It'd be a very short episode if I didn't, wouldn't it?
See what I have to put up with, Pete. Oh,
funny. Well, I think I've got a couple of models, because I think there are two parts to this. So one is the kind of the preparation for difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And then there's the bit where you're actually in the conversation, having the conversation. And I think they are separate, but I think it's useful to give some thought to both.
And I think preparing is most definitely important.
Yeah.
Getting things straight in your head so that you use the right words.
Yeah.
So that you understand, like you said in the first episode of this, what your goal is.
Yeah. Although there are times when you just get ambushed.
Yeah.
When someone else starts a difficult conversation that you weren't expecting.
When they're not doing it well.
Oh, well, they're not. Well, they're just ambushing you. You weren't expecting it.
Yeah.
So then you don't have the time to prepare. Or do you? So I think there are times where you can avoid the ambush rather than just reacting in the moment. So a few phrases that you might use when someone just launches at you and goes, "Oh, you're an idiot. You've done all this horrible," and just to say, "That's interesting. Tell me more about that." Because if someone's angry and in your face, and then the best thing you can do is keep them talking whilst you sit back and think, "Actually, what's going on here?" So it could be that, tell me more about, or it could be, that's interesting. What makes you say that? Could be a way of, again, getting it, because the more we can get out, the more information we can get out of them, the better, the more armed we're going to be for how we want to respond. Mm-hmm. But I think at that point, it's also worth knowing that you don't have to have the conversation there and then.
Yes.
And being able to say, okay, I hear what you're saying. I'm definitely prepared to have this conversation with you, but not now. I need to be somewhere else. Can we adjourn this till later? Mm-hmm. So I think there are ways of giving yourself time for that adrenaline rush of suddenly being confronted to dissipate and for you to pick it up later on, having had the time to give it some thought.
Yeah. You're
not going to respond well to someone suddenly being aggressive towards you or just catching you out. Mm. We tend to become defensive, don't we, when people catch us out?
Yes.
So if they go, you've done this, blah, 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 we sort of make excuses and that perhaps we don't need. And that's probably the time where if we're ever in a difficult conversation, we're going to lie, it's probably at that point. When we're thinking, well, you've done this. Well, no, it wasn't me, it was them. So I think, being able to get out of a difficult conversation in the moment to adjourn and have it later is a good tactic to learn.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway for a start. If you're being ambushed.
We've got a takeaway already.
Yes. Tell me more. This is interesting. It's quite hard in that moment, though, isn't it? To have the wherewithal to go, when you're being ambushed, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. It feels like it would be quite a challenge for some people to do. But I think having it in your mind, maybe having heard it, maybe no one's told you that before. I think one of the things that stops people from having difficult conversations is not knowing how to have them. And we've both said that, we've had different types of upbringing. We're both avoidant. I didn't know how to have these conversations. So maybe just hearing us say, you can say this, you can step away from that ambush moment and have some time to think. We'll give you permission to do so. I
mean, it could be that we just stay silent. Which is probably really annoying to them, but but that is another tactic when you're being confronted with someone who is being very vocal and perhaps aggressive. And if you we used to talk to people on the front line that were having to maybe deal with people that were being aggressive and were upset about what was going on for them, just that acknowledging the emotion and saying that, clearly see this is upsetting for you, recognize that, and I'm going to try and help you. So if it's that sort of situation, acknowledging the emotion and reassuring them that you wish to help could be a way of doing that. So different strategies, but I think all useful. And I say better than rather than arguing the case out, because you're not going to be at your best if you're in the moment. So if we have a difficult conversation that we wish to have, then I think I've got a model. And it's called Dodo.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know why it's called. It just fits. I needed an acronym and Dodo fitted. Nothing to do with difficult conversations, just, Dodo.
Go for it then. What's the first D?
So the first D is data. And by that is about being sure of the information that you have and maybe cross-checking that you've got it right, because the worst thing in the world is to start a difficult conversation and for someone to go, no, that's not true. That didn't happen. And for you to be wrong. I had a difficult conversation with my daughter once. She was doing some work for me and I did it really well, but I was totally wrong. So she was supposed to have done some work and she hadn't done it. And I was a bit frustrated because it wasn't the first time she hadn't done some work. And I said, I've noticed that this stuff that I'd asked you to get done by today, I can see on the screen it's still not done. And I'm feeling a bit frustrated about that. And she said, yeah. If you remember, we had a conversation yesterday where you said not to bother with that. And we just, and it suddenly came flooding back. And I went, oh, yeah, you're right. So thank goodness I hadn't gone in all guns blazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was bad enough that I was feeling frustrated. She laughed. So being sure of ourselves and say, maybe speaking to some other people just to make sure that we've got it right. So the data is really important, I think. And just being sure that it's not a story we're telling ourselves. It's actually something real that we're going to be addressing. So that's the first D. The O, the first O, is the outcome. So knowing what you want to have as an outcome for the conversation.
So going back to my difficult conversation in my job that I mentioned in the first episode of this.
About you saying, if you don't stop smoking, I'm going to leave.
Yes. I didn't have an outcome sorted for that. I think, it's a long time ago, but I thought they would go, oh yeah, you're right. Smoking in the office is ridiculous. We'll stop doing it. But no, they didn't. They just said, on your way. Actually, I was okay with that. I didn't particularly like the job anyway, and it wasn't congruent with me, so it worked out fine. But I kind of was a bit astounded by how unimportant I quite frankly was to the organisation. It was a very small company.
Tragic.
I know. So
outcome. Now, we could be very selfish about this and just thinking, well, I want it my way. If they don't, a bit like you, I want it my way, and if they don't give, I'm going. But if we think about what we want for ourselves, what we want as an outcome for ourselves, what we want as an outcome for them, because they're involved as well, and what we want as an outcome for the relationship. Now, it might be that you've just had enough, you're leaving anyway, and this is your final hurrah, I'm off, which is fine, because you don't want anything for the relationship. You just want to be on your way, don't you? So, but if it is going to be an ongoing relationship and you want to do your best to maintain that relationship, then you need to give that some thought as well. And we can't legislate for how other people are going to respond. So it might be that the relationship is over because you've had a difficult conversation with them, and we can't know that, and we can't determine how they respond. But I think if we give it some thought beforehand, then we can articulate that when we're having the conversation. All right, you might not articulate it, but we could. So I think, and I think it's really good from a coaching perspective. So if someone comes to you and they've got a story they're telling, and you ask them what conversations they've had and they haven't had any, and you talk about the conversation they could have. So being sure of the data, so we can sense check that as a coach. Asking them what they want as an outcome for the conversation, and what they want as an outcome for the other person, and what they want as an outcome for the relationship, I think can be really powerful. Because it makes them stop and think about, okay, what do I want? And if I really want the relationship to carry on in a good way, how can I have this conversation in a way that's going to ensure that?
Yeah.
So that's the first O.
Okay.
The second D is deciding whether to have the conversation or not.
With all the information, not just as a way to get out of the conversation.
No. So I say you might take the path of least resistance and decide you're not going to have it. But knowing that there will be consequences to not having it is important, and recognizing. And as we said in the last episode, that actually deciding to have the conversation could be something to do with your self-esteem, that's a boost to your self-efficacy, that you know that you can have a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And that can lead to bolstering your ability to do things, because the world isn't going to end because you have a difficult conversation. You might, as you found, you might be out of a job.
Yeah.
But that might be a good outcome.
It was fine.
In the long run.
Yeah.
It could have been the best thing that ever happened to you. So the decision, I think, is important to actually decide to do it, and committing to that decision once you've made it. Okay, I am going to have the conversation. Let's think about how I'm going to do it.
And that decision piece would be an exploration, almost like an exploration of options, wouldn't it? What happens if I do this? What happens if I don't?
Yeah.
And then making that decision.
Yeah, no, again, great as a coach to sit and hold that space for someone where they make you look at the pros and cons.
Yeah.
So the last O of Dodo is to organise.
Organise.
To organise, to have the conversation, to plan, to get your strategy sorted. How are you going to go about having the difficult conversation you're going to have? So different elements to that. So one is timing. When are you going to have the conversation with someone? Probably, well, there are times when it's not good. What you know this stuff. So what are your recognised times when you perhaps wouldn't have a conversation with someone?
Oh, I definitely wouldn't do it if I was tired, if I was hungry, or in the past, if I was hormonal. And I can obviously say that as a female. We all know there are times in the month that these conversations probably shouldn't happen and frequently do. So I think that's a consideration.
Yeah.
And I do recall having a conversation with a friend of mine who said that she'd made a decision about a relationship and she was going to end it. And it was, I just knew, as you do with friends. And I said, is this time of the month a good time to actually have that conversation? And we came back to that conversation a week later. And she still had chosen to have that conversation and end the relationship. But she then had the conversation in a different way. So I think recognising that is
so if
important.
that is a consideration, perhaps having the conversation before you get to that point, knowing that it's coming, and that won't be good, just having it beforehand. So again, it's about preparation. And so being tired, being hormonal, being hungry, being late. So if you're in a rush, that's not great. There's nothing worse than I need to talk to you about something, but I've got to go to a meeting.
I've got to do it really quickly, or I'll
talk to you after the weekend.
Don't do that.
I had a learning and development director that used to send me emails on a Friday afternoon, and I'm someone that I believe I'm always in trouble. So if someone sends me an email saying, I need to talk to you about something, I'll give you a call Monday. I was like, I had the whole weekend to invent some stories about what I'd done wrong, and generally did do that really well. And then on Monday morning, she'd ring and say, I've got another piece of work coming up. Just thinking, do you want to do it? Wait, could you do it? Hot weekend. So, yes. So make sure you've got time to have the conversation. And don't put it off. Don't tell them you're going to have it, but then say, but I can't. There are obviously within an organisational context, there are good times to have a conversation. And so I think it's as early as is appropriate. So do it as early as you can, but there are some times when it's not going to be appropriate. So if you're just about to start a busy shift with someone and you are going to be stuck together for that whole shift, then maybe not have it at the beginning of the day if you know that it might cause offence or disruption. So you might choose to have it at the end of the day so you can both go home and sleep on it. So that's probably good.
But we certainly want to try to have it before things escalate to a point where the consequences are worse or the situation is involving more people. So as you say, sooner the better. Yeah.
And I think the place is also, the location is also important and part of that organisation piece. So obviously not in front of other people is good.
Yeah, very important. You don't want to be in that situation. Also, I mean, I've just had a flashback to someone ambushing me with a difficult conversation in their car while they were driving.
Oh.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
Honestly, as the flashback came, I felt my stomach tip, and that was an interesting place to be in that conversation. That didn't go so well.
No, you just brought back a memory for me. I'm not going to go in. We could be all here all day talking about memories of difficult conversations we've had. So let's not do that. But just in terms of that open space and people not taking that well if you have a conversation. So I'm coaching someone, a clinical director at the moment, who one of her bosses criticised her in front of a group of people or kind of suggested something hadn't been done in front of a group of people, which is obviously difficult for her. caused a defensive reaction. And she also had someone who sort of sits beneath her, right? One of her direct reports, who criticised her in front of other people. So there were two difficult conversations she was going to have about what had happened and how she felt about it. So I think it's, definitely doing things behind closed doors is good.
Yeah.
So that's my dodo model.
I like it. It feels like that's the preparation and, getting to the point of having the conversation. Yeah. What top tips do you have for someone in the conversation?
Yeah, I think going into the conversation, it's going back to that, knowing what the outcome is that you want for it from the conversation. So, and knowing sort of what your boundaries are around what you're prepared to accept. So for you stop smoking or I leave. Like, you had to be prepared to leave to say that out loud.
Yes.
So just knowing what your boundaries are.
Learn from my mistake.
Yeah. So I think, again, going into that conversation, knowing what the outcome is that you want for you, for them, and for the relationship, and just keeping that in mind throughout the relationship.
And you mentioned something earlier that I thought was quite nice, and we've had this in other workshops, looking at how to open that conversation. I think sometimes that's the hard part for people.
Yeah.
How do I start that conversation? I'm here, I've done the prep, a person's sitting in front of me. Before I blurt out everything out at once, you mentioned, I've noticed that. Yeah,
I have noticed. And if you've done your organisation, your data research, you know that you're right, then I have noticed, if it's just what you've noticed, then they can't really argue with it. So if it's someone turning up late for a shift and they've done it 3 times in the last week, I've noticed you've been late 3 times in the last week. So that's the first thing. So this is my taking the despair out of difficult conversations. So the acronym here is DESPAIR.
Okay, a despair model.
Yes. But taking the despair out of difficult conversations.
Yes,
so
like it.
I have noticed is a good way to start. And then to express how you feel about whatever has happened.
So I'm guessing the D is describe what you've noticed.
Yeah.
And then emotions.
No, express how you feel.
Sorry, express how you feel.
Well, it is kind of emotion, but...
Yeah.
Or it could be expressing the consequence rather than emotion. But I think if you say, and I feel frustrated by that, so a bit like I did with my daughter, like I did feel frustrated. I was wrong, but I did feel frustrated. Yes, I think if we say, I feel frustrated. Now, it's important not to say, and you're making me feel frustrated. Because they can't make you feel that. You're choosing to feel frustrated. But so I feel frustrated. Again, they can't really argue with how you feel about it. That's how you feel about it. So I think that in terms of an opening, those are a good way to open. And then just stop talking. Just say those things and allow them to come in. Because it might be that they've got an answer. Just finishes the conversation there, a bit like my daughter did. Yeah, well, you said this yesterday. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So just give them the chance to speak. So silence is the S of despair. So just stop talking at that point and let them come in. We want to hear from them. We want to share the pool of meaning around the situation. So by inviting them to come in and say something, then we do that. Now, if they just sit there looking at you, don't have anything to say, and just shrug, or then the next part is to prompt and say, I'm interested to know what you think about this. How are you feeling about this? Mm-hmm. What's your opinion? What are your thoughts on what I've just said? Nice open coaching question. Nice open coaching question. Yeah. So encouraging them, because we want the solution to be, for both of you, we want a win-win outcome from this. So the A is saying what you would like to have happen. So what I'd like to see now as we go forward is this. And that's what you want. It might not be what they want, and they might go, well, I'm not prepared to do that. They might have their boundaries about what they can and can't do.
So it's A for aim.
A for actions.
Actions. Okay.
Because there's no point in having the conversation unless something changes.
No, absolutely.
So we want to express what we would like to see happen.
So going forward, I'd like to see you arriving on time.
Yes, if that's the thing. And then inviting them, so the I of despair is inviting them to agree to whatever actions you're asking for. Is that, well, how do you feel about doing that? Try not to ask close questions. Yes, how do you feel about that as a way forward? Again, getting them to contribute. That might be, they say, well, I'm not sure, I need to go away and think about it, which is fine. And then the R is to revisit. Because generally speaking, if it's done well, it should be something that you both go away and reflect on. I think what tends to happen, though, is people don't revisit. So they say, well, I'd like to see this in the next week. I'd like to see this happen. So how do you feel about that? And they agree to it, and then they don't do anything.
Don't do anything, yeah. And I think in an organisational context, that's often the case, isn't it? Whereas we could be saying, we've agreed on this. Let's resume this conversation in a week's time and just see how things are going.
And if you do revisit, you're going back to the beginning of the despair model. You recall we had that conversation. I've noticed that nothing has changed.
Or I've noticed that you've been on time every single day. Well,
I think the revisiting is two ways, isn't it? So if they have taken the action you would like, or something has changed, whatever the outcome was that you wanted, if that has happened, then just acknowledging that and saying thank you.
Yeah. And I think at this point, it might be useful just to reflect that in some circumstances, you opening up that dialogue and having what you perceive to be a difficult conversation might actually provide a space for that person to confide in you about something that's difficult for them, that's happening for them. And so instead of seeing this as a difficult conversation, maybe we could see it as an opportunity where it could be that they're just not organised, but it could be that there's something else going on. And you having that conversation actually turns out to be really important for them and shows that actually there's some care being taken of their well-being, or as well as the organisation. And I think bearing that in mind might take the edge off the word difficult, potentially. Yeah,
so when we do I have noticed, if you're being honest about the way you feel, then you might be frustrated, but you might also be concerned for them. And I'm concerned about how this is working for you, or whatever it is that you're concerned about.
What's happening for you? Yeah. Especially if it's out of character.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's my despair model.
I like it. Good. I do not despair of difficult conversations any longer. What else would you like to add for our listeners?
One final model, and I'm going to do it very quickly because we are kind of running on a bit.
Will we put all these in the show notes?
We'll put them in the show notes. My dear track model.
Okay, so
2 parts to it, dear and track. So the first part is how people normally respond to difficult conversations, to difficult situations. So if you're confronted, the ambush, when people get being ambushed, fight or flight. So they tend to react by denying whatever it is. No, I didn't do that. That was someone else. So that denial bit is one way of responding. Another one is to become emotional. Why are you doing this to me? Oh, you're being horrible to me. And that kind of maybe ends up in a grievance because you're treating them meanly. So that emotional part of it. And that sometimes people will use that as a strategy to get out of it. They might just cry.
Yeah.
So be prepared for some emotion. Excuses. Is the second E. So, I did do that, but I only do that because, and they'll have a reason and they'll try and talk their way out of it. And the R is for refusal. Well, that's the way I do it and I'm not going to change. On your way.
So these are all different reactions rather than one by one you go through them.
Yeah, no, just how someone might respond. And
unless they're a teenager, in which case they're going to do all 4. Potentially.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking about is if you are in a difficult conversation and that's how you respond, and your default setting is one of those, to think about how you might respond differently. And that's where the track comes in. So to actually thank someone for their input, say, oh, well, thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'm going to give this some thought. So, but thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Reflect. So to actually, rather than respond in the moment, just take the time to let it settle. And that might be, can you give me half an hour? Just let me go away and think about this. It's important, but I want to give it some thought. And then weigh up the pros and cons of any. So if they're asking you to do something differently, to actually just go away and think about it. Does this make sense? So think about, assess the situation. And then if it is something that you can change, something that you recognize would be good, to actually commit to it and say, yes, I'm happy to do that. Commit to taking the action, and then to keep revisiting it. So as the person that's maybe had some feedback or maybe been asked to do something a different way, just come back and go, just checking in. Is this okay now? Is this all happening as we want it to happen?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit probably more around getting feedback from other people, and that quite often can be a difficult conversation, can't it? But that just keeping that dialogue going. I think that's another important thing that we didn't really discuss about when you're having a difficult conversation. Just keep the dialogue going, keep it open. You want to understand both sides' point of view.
And all of these provide really interesting points of reflection in a coaching space to think about, how do I react if someone gives me feedback, if someone tells me something difficult, and so we start to understand ourselves better. And in understanding ourselves better, that's when, if we go back to that idea of a gap between whatever's happened and your response, understanding ourselves better allows us to lengthen that gap. So instead of just reacting, we can think.
Yeah, and obviously in a coaching space, we train people how to coach, and they will get feedback from the people that are observing them. And quite often that can be difficult. And people might go, well, and I did that first time I did some co-coaching online during COVID. The first Tom White gave me some feedback and said, you asked a question there that I think was a leading question. It's very gentle feedback, but I found myself going, yeah, I did, but only because. And I went, no, actually, Tom, you did right. I hold my hands up. That was a leading question.
Yeah.
So I stopped myself from doing that, excusing it and having a rationale for doing it. Good. I think we ought to leave that there.
We had, and we'll put all the resources, all your models and acronyms into the show notes. But I think it's been
dodos and deers and also.
There's lots of animals going on, isn't there? And hopefully that gives our listeners some food for thought in terms of how they might address difficult conversations with their coachees, and perhaps for themselves.
And how they may no longer despair of difficult conversations. Thank you, Helen. I've enjoyed that.
Me too. Next time on the podcast,
we will be talking about leadership in coaching.
Okay.
Or coaching around leadership. Something like that. Yes.
Okay. I look forward to it. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.